collections of poems. Oh wow, the Zoom really wanted me to know that we were being recorded. I hope you're all okay with that. It's happening. So I have two collections of poems, and I'm going to read a little bit from both of them tonight, and just kind of revel in being a poet for this series. And as David told you, my first collection is called The Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded. And what you need to know is that this colony was a real place that from the early to mid 1900s was a government-run residential hospital that was one of the major hubs of the American eugenics movement. And so what this means is that from about 1915 until about 1955, thousands and thousands of men and women who either had or were perceived to have a variety of physical and intellectual disabilities were forcibly committed and forcibly sterilized there, not only without their consent, but often without their knowledge. They were told that they were being given appendectomies and then were sterilized instead. And I grew up, as David intimated, just a few miles from the grounds of this colony, which is rare in terms of these institutions in that it remained a residential facility for people with disabilities, even after it was no longer that institution and even after they no longer performed sterilizations. And so I'll read to you a little bit from this book, and then we'll make a kind of shift. So I'm going to read. Most of the poems take place in the 1930s in the voices of imagined patients and staff at the colony, and come out of an enormous amount of research into that time period and into the eugenics movement in America in general. But this first poem is the only poem in the book that takes place in the contemporary moment, and it always feels like the right place to begin. The Central Virginia Training Center, formerly the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded. Whatever it is, home or hospital, graveyard or asylum, government facility or great tract of land slowly ceding itself back to dust, its church is a low-slung brick box with a single window, a white piece of plywood labeled chapel, and a locked door. Whatever it is, my mother and I ride along its red roads in February with the windows down. That place looks lived in. That one has stiff gray curtains in the window, a roof caving in. We see a small group moving in the channel between one building and the next, bowing in an absent wind. He is in a wheelchair. She is stumbling, pushing a pram from decades ago, coal black and wrong. There is no way it holds a baby. Behind them, a few more shuffling bodies in coats. I am my own kind of damaged there, looking out the right-hand window. Spastic, palsied, and off balance, I'm taking crooked notes about this place. It is the land where he is buried, the place she spent her whole life, the room where they made it impossible for her to have children. It is the colony where he did not learn to read, but did paint every single slat of fence you see that shade of yellow. The place she didn't want to leave when she finally could, because she'd lived there 50 years and couldn't drive a car or remember the outside or trust anyone to touch her gently. And by some accident of luck or grace, some window less than half a century wide, it is my backyard, but not what happened to my body. In the dormitory, fall 1935. Grand mal seizure. There's however it is you call, and there's whatever it is you're calling to. July, I sew my own dress from calico and lace. August, they take it off me in the colony, trade it in for standard issue Virginia cotton. Not much room for my body in the heavy slip. Maybe that's the idea. For a while, the abandoning was rare, and then it was not and would never be again. Imagine you are an animal in your own throat. The dormitory has a pitched, dark roof and a high porch. We are not allowed outside. Instead, we go to the window and make a game of racing dogwood blossoms knocked down by the wind. Choose your flower as it falls and see whose is the first to hit the clay. I beat the crippled girl every day for a week. The trick is to pick the smaller petals. Most nights they knot the bedsheet in my mouth, so I will not bite my tongue. Lay out on the pine floor, rattle your own bones back to the center of the world. In the beds, the smell of kerosene and lye. The girls wake themselves one after another, spasm, whimper, whine. Outside, cicadas. In the distance, the big house lights. Another truck comes loud up the road bearing another girl. There is whatever it is you're calling to. There is however it is you call. One of the things that was most amazing to me when I started to do research into the history of this institution is that there are almost no patient accounts of life in the colony from the height of the sterilization movement. And there are lots of complicated reasons that this is the case, right? Of course, one is the amount of shame that was associated with being a colony patient, even after people were released. But the other is that the very thing that made eugenics possible was the notion that the people being committed, being sterilized, were not whole people, right? They weren't possessed of whole and complete selfhoods or inner lives or perspectives that were worth acknowledging and listening to and recounting. And so while we have tons of letters from eugenicist doctors, while we have medical records from the colony, where we have ledgers of supplies, where we have a lot of the legal and medical language that made eugenics possible during this time, we have almost no accounts of what it was like to be a woman who was a patient in one of these facilities at the time. And I know that however much research I did and do, there is no way that these poems could stand in for the missing voices or the missing records of colony patients. But I hope that they will be a kind of kinship and that they will draw attention to that absence, right? And to the devastating fact of all of the perspectives that we have lost because a whole generation of people was denied a stake in the future of the world, right? And an opportunity to have their own voice be heard. This poem is called Labor. If you have the body for it, you're bound for the fields, to pick strawberries and coax the milk from cows, or hired out to make baking powder biscuits and gravy, to sweep floors and wash and fold a stranger's clothes. You come back on a truck after sunset, raw and ragged, covered in flour, tobacco, or clay. You come back bone tired and bruised, burned dead out, and ready to be shut away. You sleep. I know all this from stories. I do not have the body for it. I do not go to the fields or the barns or the parlors of other folks' houses. I wake at sunrise when they wake the rest, lie in bed till somebody hauls me out and puts me by the window. Lord, I know to want to work's a foolish thing to those who've got a body built for working. I was as close to born here as you can get, brought twisted and muling to the gates and left. Since then, I am one long echo of somebody else's life. Every understanding that I have is scrap, is shard, is secondhand. Distance, the space between the porch railing and the rise of the Blue Ridge. Water, what comes from a bucket to my body on Sundays, what I open my mouth for morning and night. Sex, the days the girls come back smelling of whiskey, snuff, and sweat, and something sharp. Every other thing I see is a ghost. Whatever it is you were born to do, sweetheart, there's no doing it here. Make peace with small labors, your own hand drawing a needle through a torn sheet, your elbow bending as you soak clothes in the washroom downstairs. The storm that tears the azaleas apart along the road outside, that's it for beauty. Or also, there's the way at night the girls in nearby beds teach one another to cuss. Whisper, God damn it, you bastard. Sigh, God damn it all to hell. You know, before they brought me here, I'd never seen a ghost or anything that wasn't really there. I'd never heard a voice half asleep in the blackness and had to wonder whether or not it belonged to a body. But after the swearing, someone has been singing me hymns from home. Canaan's land, the spirit shall return, traveling on. In the daylight, no one ever sings. Sometimes in the doorway, I think I see a hem trailing away outside, but there's nowhere to leave to, and nobody, sweetheart, nobody has a dress that long or lace. As you can tell, this is very cheerful reading. I hope you're all thrilled by the level of levity that's happening right now in all of these poems. So one of the most important kinds of research that I did as I was working on this book was that I went and I spent time in the physical space of what was formerly the Virginia State Colony and is now called the Central Virginia Training Center. And although it has just recently closed, it was until last year, as I said, an operational residential facility for adults with serious disabilities. Like a lot of things in the American South, as many of you all know, it was built on an enormous amount of land. And so this crazy thing happened, which is that as the original buildings fell into disrepair, instead of being either rehabbed so that they could be up to code and utilized or knocked down, they just moved out of them and then built new buildings next to them on all the land that was available. And so the place is this amazing combination of a historical facility and a contemporary functioning residential hospital. And it's wild, and it makes visiting it this crazy kind of palimpsest where you can like see through something into all the layers of its history. And one of the things that I was struck by when I went to visit the colony was the really small number of spaces that actually comprised the original grounds. There was a dormitory, there was the kind of major administrative building, there was obviously an infirmary where all of these sterilizations were performed, and there was also a chapel. And that was really fascinating to me. To think, who was that chapel built for? Was it built for the patients? And if so, how did they conceive of these people as needing or having a relationship with God? Was it built for the staff? And if so, how did they reconcile what they were doing with their faith? And sort of what was this place doing here? In addition to the chapel, the only other sort of non-utilitarian place that existed in the colony grounds was a place called the blind room, which was the term that the colony used for solitary confinement. And it was the place they put colony patients when they were being punished, essentially. And you can already hear probably from these first few poems the ways in which they're already inflected with my questions about sort of what, if anything, God is doing, or what, if anything, people make of God in this space. And I'm going to read two poems from the blind room section of the book, and then a few poems from the section of the book that is about and takes place in this chapel that I found, all of which have to do with these questions of faith. So this is called The Blind Room, an Execration. This is the beginning of the world, or this is the world before God made it. Empty space, darkness over the deep, no sense where the edges are. I promise it is the worst place you've ever been. That's what I meant. The blind room means the world unmakes itself in an instant. The door shuts, the sun vanishes, and with it, all the things the light makes. Patterns in the dust at all, the shape of the chair, your own shadow. Swallow, beetle, lightning bug, brother, all unraveled, all undone. At first, you will tell yourself stories. Remember that fall meant a bonfire, the ribcage of a buck lit up with whatever limbs the storm brought down. Old wood burns sweeter than green. The smoke stays on your skin for days. Remember your mother combing it out of your hair on the porch, your father playing banjo, then the way the late October thunderstorm rolled in and drank away the stars. And this is called The Blind Room, a Consecration. This is the beginning of the world, or this is the world before God made it. Empty space, darkness over the deep, no sense where the edges are. Eventually, it is the best place you've ever been. In the blind room, the world unmakes itself in an instant. The door shuts, the sun vanishes, and with it, all the things the light makes. Fissures in the dust at all, the shape of the chair, your own shadow. Sparrow, possum, sheep moth, brother, all unraveled, all undone. At first, you will tell yourself stories. Remember, you could ford a river, hold a log level, hit a long, high note. You close your eyes to silence. After a while, blessedly, you are the only creature. Everything is without history. There was never anyone but you in this cold, lightless place. There was never any voice but yours, never any throat but the one you're humming with now, and the high accompanying call that must, thank God, be Gabriel swallowing the final stars. So most of the poems in this book are from the point of view, as I said, of imagined colony patients. But it was important to me that there be occasional poems in the book that were in the perspective of colony staff, people who worked at the colony. And a lot of that was because I think we have this tendency when we think back on the atrocities of history, the things we are ashamed of, the things we understand as evil acts. It's comfortable to think, oh, that was a thing perpetrated by monsters, right? By people who look nothing like me or anyone I love. It's a thing that couldn't happen now in this contemporary moment, right? And I think we get in trouble when we assume that, right? Because in fact, many, if not most, of the evil acts of the world were perpetrated by people who were human and fearful and flawed and misinformed and look a whole lot like we are now. And we are capable of making the same mistakes again and again. And so it was important to me to imagine what it would be like, not just to be a woman who was a colony patient, but to be someone who worked in that space, right? And who understood or tried to understand the thing that they were doing as just. And in that vein, this poem is called Prayer for the Wretched Among Us. Always they tell you to go where God calls you. What they don't say is that sometimes God will call you to the wilderness, gesture toward the trees, and then hang back and wave you on alone. This is how I wound up granting absolution to low-grade idiots and the worn-out women who turn them over in bed at night. At dawn, go home to their own families. Try not to think of ghosts wasting away in the world. 2. You are not supposed to be afraid of sinners. You should take off your shoes and give them to the wretched and the damned. Hold out your hand to every girl, even if she seems more animal, statue, or remnant of plague than lost disciple. But do the children of God really lose their eyes in the backs of their heads and swallow their own tongues in church? 3. I should think of her as an infant, a baby who is saved, although she cannot say God's name or even understand it. But her knees drawn up in the wash tub tower past her chin. I pour holy water from a chipped blue pitcher, cannot call up a prayer. 4. I'm glad for the 20 miles I drive over the mountain each week, for the latched red gate at the mouth of Colony Road, for the gloves I wear on days I have to give last rites in the infirmary. My wife is pregnant. I am looking into the mouth of a nightmare. Driving home in the dark, I beg forgiveness and louder for protection and the distance to forget. And I think I'll read just two more poems from this section, and then I'll switch to reading just a couple of poems from my later book, which is slightly more cheery, although not hugely. I hate to break it to you. And so this poem is called Psalm. Once it was clear I would not die in early childhood, you wheeled me out along the coach road to the chapel to be baptized. Even half-wits might well have a soul to save. The concession science makes to faith. Whatever sins are visited upon my body, best to do all you can to cleanse them before they ease into the air like plague. After all, you would not want my life. Your children's children would not want my life. Stale sickness, some stranger stealing herself to touch you and then recoiling. The meek will inherit the earth, but you worry the mute and monstrous will pollute it long before that happens. So you strip me down, hold my head under the water in the basin, count to 3 and pray in every language that you know. Dear God, bless this girl. Take her up and let her be the end of it. Put some distance between our bodies and hers. Take her out of our hands. Father, whatever force or fate has made me like this. Son, what will protect your daughters from a future like mine? Holy Ghost, you cannot hear what I am saying in the cathedral of my own head. And I'll read one final poem from this book, which is called The Convulsions Choir. They did not build the church for us. I overheard one night nurse talking to another. They meant it for the staff as a refuge from the stench, the idiot, and the insane. They meant you will need God more than ever in this place. After all, we are a whole host of reasons to stop believing in anything. I am the worst thing the reasoned world has wrought. An otherwise lovely girl daily visited by radical disorder, they say, spawned somewhere quiet and foaming in the wounded matter of my body and my brain. Sundays, we are allowed in the chapel for an hour in the morning after the men have prayed and gone. There are too many bodies for the pews, so those who can all gather in the back like starlings stunned after a storm. I'd like to take the hands of the other epileptic girls and lead them up toward the altar, humming and weaving our arms together like chains. I wonder if in concert we could call it up like hymns, like speaking in tongues. We could lie down and demand to be raptured or healed, to return to safer bodies or to dust. As the weeks I'm here grow achingly to months and years, I make an outside world of this space between my bones. They did not build the church for us, but they leave us alone inside it. Bar the door. Okay, you know what? I lied. I can't leave it in quite that dark a place. We're gonna try to get a little lighter before we leave this book behind. So I'm going to read the 2 poems that end the book. They're very short, and they let a little bit of brightness in. At first, it's going to seem like, oh, this was a bad call. It's only getting worse. But I promise it. There's lightness before the end. So this is called After All, Nothing. One morning, I wake up and the visions are bees pouring from my belly into the globes of my eyes. Someone hurls a shoe at me to stop my screaming. Otherwise, no one comes. I pass an hour like this. This is what no one tells you about suffering. Other people visit it upon you, and then you visit it upon yourself. And this is called After All, Everything. This morning I wake up and for a moment I think the visions have vanished. Then I realize everything is shaded green. The visions have a lit like Luna moths around the dormitory, on the doorframe and the table and the face of every sleeping girl. When I blow out my breath, they travel noiselessly into the air. I pass an hour like this. This is what no one tells you about suffering. Sometimes you would not give it up for all the world. All right, and we'll leave that there in a slightly brighter place. You can probably tell from my first book that a lot of my work is interested in the ways in which poetry can examine and complicate and expand upon and grapple with the record, right? The way we think about history, the way we think about the past, the way we think about what is. And my second book, which I actually co-wrote with another poet whose name is Susanna Nevison, who's phenomenally wonderful and talented, is a book called In the Field Between Us. And it's a book of epistolary poems, so letters that we wrote largely to one another about the experience of growing up in bodies that have again and again and again been surgically altered and been subject to a lot of medical treatment. And so I kind of turned my interest from the public historical record to my own private record, right? And the endless sense of what it means to live in a body that has this huge record of alteration from the shape that it was born in. And so, as I said, the book is largely letters that we wrote to one another. So I'm going to read a couple of those just from the beginning of the book. Dear M, the dream where I'm legless isn't a nightmare, and I'm not afraid. There's light and a river, and everything is exactly how I'd hoped. I'm not tethered to the earth. I'm not tied down by gravity, dragging my legs along the bank gravel, not searching for the softest patch of moss. I'm not even tired, and though I'm certain the dream is an elegy, it sounds exactly like a praise song. In the dream, my legs break free of me, and I watch them float away. The coffin in my chest blows open in the wind, and for once, I think I know what it's like to be without all our dead and heavy things. Dear S, I've said this all before, and anyway, you had already been picked up, held down, put under, and refashioned. You were already dreaming your body in some gravityless country, already calling it a river, Mars. Let's go back to wherever it is we were made for first, to water or a rusted, windswept planet where everything floats and women are part horse or fox, knocked off kilter and galloping left to get where they were meant to go. We'd miss it here eventually. The boat that brought us, I believe in it. But having found you, I am seeking out the channel where we came from. Sister, take my hand. Dear M, maybe it's a pronoun problem after all. Our bodies, you and me, the lot of us in search of ways to address each other when we can't even fully turn around inside this room. When we sleep, of course we come unraveled. It's only fair. Awake, we're always pushing against another kind of self, who pushes back or pulls us down or makes us stay, the kind who doesn't let us go too far, who strokes our hair, keeps us tame. When we sleep, I believe we leave some selves behind. In the morning, they stare back at me across the room, and though I look away, they always plead with me. Tell us where we've been. Dear S, today the doctor's office called to say he'd see me in November and take every photograph at once. My knees and hips and back to see what's what. And I heard, survey the damage, tell your fortune, reach right in, cast you out. And all my smaller selves, they hunkered down like children, tender in their fear, swore that they'd file down their claws and fall in line or let me loose if that was what I wanted. Begged me to keep them a secret, not to hold them out there in the light. Years ago, they spent a long time in the theater, fumbling their blocking, being stretched and prodded, asked to pose, stitched together, rent apart. There are so many star charts made in their image, so many maps of how they move. But then there was this mess of wild, unwatched years. My hair grew long, my cells grew wedded to their unseen galaxy. They want no cartograph, no telescope. They want neither to know or to be known. I have been asking for an answer, a relief map. I have begged to be found out. Now, some maker readies the compass, readies the camera, readies the knife. And all of me rallies to pull closed the curtains, to cover my face. The other letters in this book, it's a book entirely of letters, and the other ones in this book are letters addressed to a maker figure, all of which begin Dear Maker, and that maker figure is God, is surgeon and doctor, is artist, is a kind of unknowable figure. And I just want to close by reading a few of those poems, and then I'm thrilled to take some questions. Dear Maker, listen, if I can't know what you first whittled me out of, I would like to see the knife. The quick groove in an upper lip is called a philtrum, like a blade slipped once, caught just before the damage grew too large to make the best of it, to fill a body up with neat little canals and say you meant to cut a river there. If I can't know my body before it was riven, show me your hands. Right now, there's just the ghost of how they turned around my body, wrenched the whole thing toward another north. Writing these letters was really interesting because Susanna and I have really different relationships with God, in that I am sure that there is something there and she's pretty sure that there's not, and so it was really fun to kind of navigate that space and the difference between presence and absence, and the things that we believed in that space. And so I'm gonna close with just two more of these maker letters. Dear Maker, it snows in this strange city. I'm bewildered by the white, the way it makes one perfect creature of the place. One body built up soundless overnight, then blown to pieces by the wind, and how I barrel into it. My body as unsubtle here as anywhere. I distrust the weather in my body. There's a sudden shallow warmth before tornadoes whistle damage down. Before my body had these seams, there had to be a shattering I don't remember. You'd have had to turn your face away from all the shards. And this last poem I wrote, and I wrote after spending time in an anatomical theater in Italy, at the very first medical school in the West, which was the place that surgery, as we understand it, was essentially born. The place that the very first human anatomy classes were taught and conducted. Dear Maker, look at the marble table, the cleaver, and the stars they built to watch the butchering. The human constellations cut into the ceiling there. Hosts of older gods and men of science lined shoulder to shoulder, sharp as buzzards on the walls. I'm half a world away from the country I was born in, and this is not a church. But Maker, look, here is what I believe in. All those years ago, they butterflied a body just to put their hands inside, learn ligament, lymph node, liver, and lung, how one piece dictates another, how a creature runs. One man bent over another and forgot himself. Thought, look, what's done can be undone and redone better. Took a chisel and a saw and some string to the body, pared away error, practiced what would one day make me. How to see the body as a country you can section and redraw without a sacrifice. Look, here a whole new kind of grief is born out under whittled stars. Thanks, y'all.
Molly,
Yeah,
thank
and I'm
you.
happy to chat, David, or take questions or do whatever you want.
Awesome, Molly, thank you so much. And grateful for all of you joining us this evening. I want to welcome you in. If you feel comfortable, we'd love it if you could turn on your video. It'll make for a engaging conversation with Molly for a few minutes here. And if you have a question for Molly that you'd like, you can use the chat, or you could also just take yourself off mute. Molly, gosh, I don't even know where to start. There's so many questions I have, but let me, the body, our embodied nature is a key theme that runs through your poetry and your prose. Certainly what we've been through in the past year during COVID has reminded each and every one of us in new ways, perhaps, of our embodied nature. What's it been like for you? Maybe we just start in talking a little bit about going through COVID, you know, as a teacher, as an artist, as someone with a disability. Tell us how you have processed the past year, and how has the past year maybe informed in new ways your sense of our embodied nature, both as individuals, but also as a community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And in some ways, I think to fully answer this question, I'm going to need a little more time. You know, I'm very much a human being who believes that we need to be farther away from something before we can see the totality of it. And I don't, we're maybe approaching toward sort of walking toward the end of something, but we're not there. I feel very close still to so much of this year, if not still sort of inside of it. But I do think it has been really interesting as someone who has sort of always been deeply cognizant of both the centrality of the body and of the fact that we are embodied people, and also the fragility of the body, right? And the sort of ways in which it is both highly central and highly demanding, and also in which its existence is tenuous, right? It's been interesting to sort of watch the world and the country as a whole wake up to that realization, and it's a little bit like, hello, welcome to the party. We've been here waiting for you for a while, but it's also really interesting to it's been a really interesting year to be an educator and to try to help the young people who are my charge navigate through that feeling and that understanding and that fear, because I think so much of the time youth, one of the hallmarks of youth is that you feel sort of vaguely invincible, right? You're young, you're always going to be young, you're always going to be invincible in this certain kind of way. And so I think it's been really interesting to watch what it's like to be a young person, understanding that we're mortal, right? And we're fragile in that mortality, in a particular kind of way. And of course, there have been always young people for whom that understanding is very present. But I think it was again, a more sort of communally shared thing. And it's been interesting to think about what it means to have a language that and an awareness that for so long belonged mostly to me and to a very particular community and to a very particular sort of community that I share this understanding with in terms of people with disabilities or chronic illness, suddenly belong to a much larger group of people, right? And that's really interesting. And I think I'm still sort of processing my way through what that means and how it's going to change, if it's going to change how I write, and what comes next. But I certainly think this is an opportunity for us to understand that fragility, not to become more fearful, but to become more careful, as in full of care, right? And more intentional, and more aware too of the fact that public health, and I mean that in many senses, in a highly expansive sense, is a necessarily communal activity, right? It's not something that we can or should engage in alone, and it's something that we have to engage in with other people in mind. Being a mortal person in a mortal and fallible and failing body means being a person who is necessarily in communion and in community with other people in the world, right? And I think that is really important.
Molly, thank you. You don't often see first books that are so fully formed and cohesive. I think, there's so many things that's impressive about your first book, about the institution in Virginia. Give us a sense, if you would, how that book began to take shape for you. Was there a spark? Was there a moment where you said, oh my goodness, like I'm going to write this book and it's going to be this whole thing. You know what I mean? I'd love to hear more about that moment for you creatively, where you said, wow, this is bigger than a single poem.
Totally. So I, as I said to y'all in the beginning of this talk, I grew up just a few miles from the grounds of the colony, and I knew about it sort of glancingly. I knew that it was a residential facility for adults with serious disabilities. I knew that it had this complicated history tangled up with Appalachia and the Great Depression and eugenics, but I didn't think about it a ton. And then when I was in college, the summer between my sophomore and junior year of college, I took a friend who was having sort of a hard time on like a road trip from the city where I was living, like an hour north of my hometown for the summer, down sort of through my hometown. And it was supposed to be like a really funny road trip. The idea was like, oh, we're going to go see these like goofy things about the small town where I grew up. I'm going to distract you for a day. We're going to take your dog. We're going to eat McDonald's. It's going to be great. And instead it changed my whole life, because we decided that we were going to pull off at Colony Road and we drove by. And the hilarious thing now is that I can't even remember why we decided that we were going to do that. I can't remember if like her dog needed to pee, or if we were just like, I don't know, we have time. What are we doing? We've never been to this place. So we pull off at Colony Road, and I walk around the space and I see a lot of what I described to you guys, right? Which is the simultaneous existence of these historical buildings and this contemporary facility. I read some of the like super vague, sort of like very couchy historical markers that exist around the facility, where they like essentially say, oh, we sterilized a whole bunch of people like trying really hard not to say that out loud. They're kind of an amazing exercise in like historical obfuscation. And it was like we ended up spending an incredibly long amount of time there. We walked around the cemetery, and I just was like, well, this is something major that I will never be the same from. And I remember going home and Googling the place and sort of doing some research and learning a little bit about it. But I had the good sense to be like, I'm 18. I don't have the skills necessary to approach this yet. And so I just kind of put it away for a few years, but I never really stopped thinking about it. I never stopped thinking about the history. I often found myself sort of coming back to that place. And then after college, I was in some years of my life that are, I think, maybe typical of people who have just graduated, but at the time felt very singular and deeply distressing, where I was like, how do I be a writer outside of the classroom? What am I even good at? If anything, what am I going to do? And sort of casting around for something that felt like it mattered. And I pulled that research back out, I think, like a lot of people who grew up in one singular place and in one singular landscape, if I'm looking for meaning and steadiness, I often look back toward that landscape. And so I was like, I don't know, home. And I pulled that material out, and pretty quickly, and I think without knowing it, I was also grappling with a lot of complicated feelings surrounding my own disability and my own body and what it was like to be aging into an adulthood that still existed in this body. And I think that institution really, the material just really spoke to me, and I sort of felt like, okay, I'm ready to try this. And at first it just looked like reading a lot, looking up a lot of local journalism, going to archives, spending a lot of time in the archives. But eventually I got to the place, and this is always how I know when I'm writing something that really works, which is like at that point I had a teaching job. I was working as a teaching artist in the public schools, so I would teach all day, and then I would come home, and I just wanted to write, and I wanted to sort of get these poems out. And I was like, eating Cheerios, dry Cheerios out of the box with one hand, so that I could keep typing, and like falling asleep with all the lights in my house on. And it took a lot of years to get the book to what it became, but it only took a few months to get the first draft of that manuscript, because I felt it felt so necessary. At a certain point, I felt less like I was writing poems and more like I was sort of channeling this history and this voice from outside of myself. And I still don't have a totally good intellectual explanation for what happened there, except that like my poems and my work in general, I firmly believe are smarter than me. And I always know it's working when I feel like I have very little control over what's actually happening here. And it's something that's bigger and smarter and more interesting than I am. And that's certainly what happens, I think, in this moment.
Do you remember which of the poems came first?
Yeah, so the poem that I wrote first is actually the second poem in the book, and I read it to y'all. It's the poem called Grand Mal Seizure. And that was the very first poem I wrote. And I was like, okay, I think we can do this. And the poems I wrote, I wrote the poems in the book, not exactly in the order that they occur in the book, but almost. I think I had a pretty good sense of the shape of what I was doing. And I know you might have gotten a sense from hearing me read that the sections of the book are, they're all divided up into rooms in the colony. So I read from the dormitory section, I read from the blind room section, I read from the chapel section. And I knew pretty early on that was going to be the way that it went, because I wanted the reader to feel transported into this physical space, because being in the physical space had been so important to me in doing my research for the book, and it felt so singular. And I wanted to do everything I could to really put the reader there in every sense that I knew how to.
Well, I just absolutely love, even in the selection that you had tonight, the diversity of voices, but also you can hear this common experience of being in that place. I want to switch gears, and I want to ask you one question, and then we're going to get to questions from the group. Molly, you said earlier in your talk tonight that you're pretty sure something's there in terms of God. I love that. And, you also in one of the poems describe a God that leads us into the wilderness and says, okay, it's up to you now. So,
Bye.
Best of luck. If you're comfortable, I'd love if you'd share about a moment where you felt like you might have been out there in the wilderness spiritually, and the relation for you between poetry and prayer.
Yeah, so those are great questions. And I think to answer the first one, I mean, I would say that it's really funny, because I would say the thing that makes me feel the most out there in the wilderness spiritually frequently is also the reason that I feel as if I have no choice but to believe in God, and I do, which is that I was an identical twin. And we were born at 27 weeks. We weighed combined less than 4 pounds. We were very small, and I survived, and my twin did not. She died about 48 hours after we were born. Which, and I gotta say, being a surviving identical twin is wild, man. Because on the one hand, I didn't know this person. She died when she was only a baby. She's only been an absence, really, essentially. And I miss her, and there are all sorts of things I don't know about her. And also I feel her presence and I feel her absence in my body in a particular way. Like I feel like a thing carved down the middle. And I feel cognizant of that. And I feel certain both that she's gone from this world and also that there is something that persists of her in me and beyond it. And so it's like, well, shit, at that point, you're really mad at God because it feels terrible. And you feel abandoned and you feel mad and you feel like this terrible thing happened both to me and to this person I love before I even had done anything. What the hell? But also you don't have any choice but to believe in something beyond this life we're living in, right? Because this feeling, this knowing this other person, this missing this other person, this sense of a presence, it has been part of my life for as long as I can remember, right? And it has to mean there's something else beyond this life we're living because I feel it every day. And so you were sort of both simultaneously always in the wilderness thinking, what the hell and why? And also you are a deeply faithful person because what are you going to do otherwise? And those things just live alongside each other, I think, in a really particular way. And then to your second question, I would say that the thing that poetry and prayer share for me is that for a lot of my life, I am a person who often physically has no choice but to move slowly, right? It's hard for me to get around. I use a wheelchair a lot of the time. I just literally physically move slowly through the world. And for a lot of my life, I just resisted and resisted and resisted that slowness. I hated it. I hated the limitations of my body. I was mad about it. I was like, I want to go faster and I want to do more and I don't want to be doing this thing. And I would say that the thing that poetry gave me first and eventually prayer gave me in its connection is an opportunity to understand the slowness as offering me something. Because I move more slowly and more deliberately through the world, the quality of my attention is different. The quality of my listening is different. The quality of my openness is different. And I would say that for me, coming both to poetry and to prayer happens when I am able to quiet my indignant, impatient, protesting heart and embrace the stillness and the slowness and open myself up to the opportunity and the expansiveness that offers. And that's the thing that they share.
Molly, I could ask you questions all night, but Boyd wonders a couple of poets who've influenced you most and why.
Oh Lord. So this question, I could answer it for like 6 hours, and also it would change a little bit every day. My sort of like guiding star, lodestar forever and ever and ever has been Emily Dickinson, who is the poet who I think has the most interesting relationship with faith in lots of ways of all these poets out there, because she is the sort of consummate like believer and non-believer and like mad person trying to sort out the difficult yoke between body and
Hopefully, friends, Molly comes back to us in a second here. Is she frozen on all of your screens? Okay. Let's see. Oh, she just logged off. Hopefully she'll log back on. Oh, there she is.
hello.
Welcome
about
back.
that.
Welcome back, Molly.
I have no idea what that was about. What is the last thing you heard me say?
We were talking about how Emily Dickinson is the lodestar because of the struggle between the bodily and the spiritual, and I think that's where we left off, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I would say that I have this memory still of going into my parents' bedroom and discovering at like 8 years old a copy of her collected poems and reading The soul has moments of escape when bursting all the doors, she dances like a bomb abroad and swings upon the hours. And thinking, okay, I have no idea what the hell that means, but whatever it is, like I want to do that magic, that music, that compression, that desperation. I want to do that thing. And I still like, she's the place I go when I feel like I need poetic help, when I feel like I need spiritual help, when I feel like I need to be reminded of what I'm about. That's my place. But I also think there are so many contemporary poets who are doing work both explicitly and less explicitly about spirituality that really matters to me. The poet Christian Wyman is a really phenomenal poet who writes a lot about sickness and faith and embodiment and the complexities there. Y'all heard from Spencer Reese, who I think is an absolute genius, in addition to, as I told David, the most sincere person on the actual planet. Jericho Brown writes really, really beautifully about faith and politics and race and living in America in this moment as a Black man. It's an incredible, his newest book is called The Tradition, and it's incredibly important and wonderful. I love Natasha Trethewey's work as it relates to history and selfhood and belief. Yeah, again, as I told you, I could answer this question like all the live long day.
Molly, that's awesome. Thank you. I think we'll have time for one more. I want to second all of the writers that Molly mentioned. And Natasha Trethewey, if you're looking for a great memoir, she had an award-winning memoir that came out called Memorial Drive, which is just stunning and beautiful. And
it's
maybe,
beautiful. It's also, full disclosure, absolutely heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
You should read it only if you are willing to have your heart be shattered into a million pieces and then put back together by its beauty and intelligence, but also first totally shattered.
Amen. Amen. Maybe one more question. I want to be mindful of Molly's time tonight. Is it a question? You can take yourself off mute, use chat.
Yeah, Lee.
Hi, I just really loved your reading. Thank you so much. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the epistolary writing process and sort of what you learned from that, what was interesting to you about it.
Totally. So I love an epistolary poem. I think one of the things that I am always most drawn to in poems is a sense of intimacy, right? A sense of like real knowingness. And the epistolary poem lends itself so well to that because you're writing to a particular person, right? And so there's an assumed kind of knowledge and tenderness and directness that I think is really irreplaceable. And when you read it, you're kind of like a voyeur, right? You're listening in on something intimate and tender and lovely. And it was such a pleasure to write this book. Susanna Nevison, who is the poet who I wrote it with, is my best friend in the world. She's the person I know and love best in many ways. And also she was someone with whom I shared both the experience of being a poet and the experience of being a person with a disability that had been who has been sort of in medical care and in surgical intervention for the course of her whole life. And that was an experience that I had never really shared with anyone that I was deeply close to before, and certainly never shared with another writer, right? And so it was really special to sort of be sharing both the language of poetry and the language of medicine in that way, and to feel like this was this person for whom I wasn't having to translate at all. And when we started this book, we really started it as a way of avoiding other projects. She had sort of just finished her second collection of poems, and I was trying to avoid having to sort of do a last pass before she sent it out into the world. And I had agreed to write this essay collection that I was having a really hard time with. And so we were both like, oh, we don't want to do either of the things that we're supposed to do. Maybe we'll just do this other thing instead. And it started as kind of a joke because we'd been joking for as long as we'd known one another about how funny it would be if we wrote a book where we just talked to each other. Because we were sort of like, I wouldn't want to read that. That would be really weird. But then we were like, we wonder if we can pull it off. And so we just started literally in our emails writing these poems to each other, these letters to each other. And I think the first 4 or 5, I literally don't even think I wrote in a Word document. I think I typed them like into the body of my Gmail account. And we were just kind of trying to see, but pretty quickly we were like, oh, we actually think this is kind of magical. And so we just sort of started trading them, and it helps that we're really comfortable with each other. So she's one of only a very small handful of writers in the world to whom I would send something that I thought was probably pretty bad, right? So it was easy to just be like, I don't know if this is any good. And then we sent a few to an editor we trusted, and we're sort of like, does anyone who isn't us understand these? And she was like, first of all, yes, and second of all, please keep going. And so then we did, and for a while it was just very individual. We just sort of wrote letters back and forth. We didn't do a ton of editing. And then when we got to the point where we were like, oh, we probably have enough of these, but it's like, this is getting to be a book, we sat down together and really edited the poems jointly, like physically on the floor. And the maker poems kind of took place afterwards. We knew the book needed another register, and we wanted something else, but that didn't sacrifice the intimacy. And actually, as I said, we have really different relationships with faith. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of push on that and to think about what happened. And those poems are also really interesting because, unlike the others, they don't have an address that reveals who wrote which poem, right? Because if it's Dear M, you can tell that that's probably Susanna's poem. And if it's Dear S, you can tell that it's mine. But with the maker poems, you don't know whose mouth they came out of. And so we were interested in that. And the book was a total blast because I never hated it the same way you eventually hate your own writing that you do by yourself, because you're like, oh, I've lived with this so long and it's so bad. Because I loved her poems, right? And it was like double your money or your chips for free, right? You write a poem and then another one just like appears, and it was totally magical. So I really recommend doing work with something like that with someone you love and respect and admire. It was like a blast in a way that nothing else is and has been.
Oh, Molly, that was awesome. Lee, great question. Molly, just real quick, I want to make sure you know Lee teaches on faculty at Florida State, and she has written some fabulous books about Johnny Cash, Dolly Parton, and her book that's going to be coming out soon is on Prince. So,
oh my God, let's talk about country music. I love, this is my jam. Oh, I'm gonna write to you. I have a secret dream where I write a bunch of poems that are also country songs. That's
great. Good to see my friend Olivia, who's a fellow student in the creative writing program at Florida State. And just a quick, we're going to end now. I really could talk to Molly all night. This has been such a great reading. I just wanted to share briefly that when Molly was sharing about the epistolary form, it made me think, of course, the New Testament, half of it is written in letters from people to each other, right? And then just very quickly, I'm thinking also of my friend Bruno Navasky, who is the son of Victor Navasky, who's was the founder and publisher of The Nation magazine. But Bruno, when he was a child, wrote an epistolary book with Alice Trillin, the wife of Calvin Trillin. He had leukemia, she had leukemia, and they wrote to each other to, and it was this profound book, to a child, to an adult. But it made me also think of, I've shared this story with some of you before. Calvin and Alice Trillin worked at a summer camp for children with disabilities for much of their life. Alice is now deceased. And there was one child that they got to know at the camp who was just this amazing, let's just call her Phoebe. And she was the most amazing child. And Alice and Calvin wanted to know, like, what made this child so special? And Alice was in charge of the mailroom at this summer camp. And so there was a letter, talk about epistles. There was a letter that this child, Phoebe, had received from her parents. And Alice said, I know I shouldn't do this, but she ended up doing it. She opened the letter because she wanted to know what could make this child so amazing, and just so full of love and light. And basically the letter from the parents to this child said the following, Phoebe, had there been 1 million children in the world, you are the only child we would have chosen. And Alice handed the letter to Calvin and said, read this, it's the secret to life.
Amazing.
So Molly, thank you for reminding us time and time again tonight of the secret of life, what life is all about, which is about love. And on that note, what I'd like to do is just end with this prayer that comes to us from the New Zealand prayer book. It's a prayer for nighttime and stillness, and it made me think of what Molly said about the connection between prayer and poetry. So friends, let us pray. Lord, it is night. The night is for stillness. Let us be still in the presence of God. It is night after a long day. What has been done has been done. What has not been done has not been done. Let it be. The night is dark. Let our fears of the darkness of the world and of our own lives rest in you. The night is quiet. Let the quietness of your peace enfold us, all dear to us, and all who have no peace. The night heralds the dawn. Let us look expectantly to a new day, new joys, new possibilities. In your name we pray. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for the last in this series. Molly, I can't imagine a better way to close this Word Made Flesh poetry reading series. Thank you all for blessing us with your presence tonight, and I pray that you have a peaceful night. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.